You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Bryan Caplan of George Mason University. He is the author of The Case Against Education: Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money. Bryan, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, your book, needless to say, has a very provocative title and subtitle. I imagine that, I imagine you're going to sell a lot of books, but I imagine also that you're going to create a lot of controversy. So let's dive right into the details. I've read your blog and such for a long time, and for years you have been a proponent of the signaling model of education. So why not start by explaining that and how we get from it to this radical thesis that the whole education system is a waste of time and money?
All right. So first point. So it's clear that education does causally raise income to some degree. But why does it do that? The standard story, usually called the human capital story, says that you go to school and they pour job skills into you, and then you're more productive, and then, of course, employers will pay you more. But there's another story that I'm a big fan of, which is called the signaling model, and it says that rather than actually learning useful skills in school, what you do in school is show that you were already skilled. It's a way of convincing employers. It's a way to get certified. You get a bunch of stamps in your forehead saying grade A worker. You jump through the academic hoops, and if you do well, come out at the other end, graduate especially, and then people like you more. In terms of the selfish payoff, it doesn't really matter why education pays. But socially speaking, what I argue in the book is that it matters tremendously. Because again, if the main thing that a school does is pour skill into workers, then taxpayers invest money in education and they get a more skilled workforce. But if the main thing that's going on is that it helps people jump through hoops to impress employers, well, if everyone is impressive, nobody is. You've got to be more impressive than other people to really impress. So if the signaling model is a big part of the story, then a lot of the investment of taxpayer dollars and student time is actually socially very wasteful. It's basically redistributive because you're looking good at the expense of other people. Now, just to be clear, my view is not that every single thing that happens in school is signaling. I'm the first one to admit that you learn some useful skills in school. But I do say that there's a very high share of the payoff that's explained by signaling, and my preferred estimate is about 80%.
I've heard it described as a rat race or, a zero-sum sort of thing. I'm reminded of there was an event I was going to, and the event organizers sent out a mass email to everyone beforehand saying to show up early because there was going to be a line. And of course,
yeah, that's a great example.
That's great if you send it to one person, hey, show up early, there's going to be a lineup. But if you send it to everyone, then it just has us all lining up for longer.
Yeah, it's like the old advertisement, supplies are limited, so order now. And well, wait a second. If everyone orders now, then the supplies won't just be limited, they'll be gone.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, that's that's great for the person trying to create hype or to sell a product as fast as they can. But it's very personally costly to the people who show up and wait in line. So you said that that the number to put on it was 80% signaling, 20% human capital. And of course, that's only the part of education that is causal, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, what I say is, first, you can't just think that because college graduates make 73% more money on average than high school graduates, that college causes a 73% increase. There's a lot of pre-existing advantages that college graduates bring to the table. Generally, the people going to college were the better students to begin with, so it's important to go and make due adjustments for that. But I do say even after you go and adjust for everything you can think of, there still does seem to be a pretty solid economic payoff for the individual for school. And what I'm mostly going after is the social payoff and saying, look, the individual payoff is pretty good, but the social payoff, on the other hand, that's what's crummy.
Okay, so let's talk about where that 80-20 number comes from. What kind of a study or statistical analysis would one perform to get that breakdown?
Yeah, so there are multiple bodies of evidence that I appeal to try to triangulate the true number. There isn't one magic study that I say this is the one that proves the number. And again, like I say, I am open-minded about exactly what the number is just because there isn't nearly enough research on it. But let me just go through the main areas that I rely on. So the first thing is just looking at the curriculum. So for high school, we have a very good tabulation of how much of their time people spend on different subjects. And there, a shockingly low share is spent on literacy and numeracy in high school. So we're talking maybe 25% or so. All right. So I think it might be 30%. So anyway, so, like a large majority of the time is spent on things other than literacy and numeracy. Right. And, so much of it is stuff where it would be amazing if you ever used it again. So, it's like people spend a lot of time on foreign languages. No one in the U.S. learns foreign languages to a professional degree in school, virtually no one. So like history, social sciences, art, music. These are all subjects where there's almost no jobs. Again, for college majors, I also just look at what share of college majors are even semi-plausibly vocational, and then maybe 25%. All right, so just looking at the curriculum is where I start. Then there's several other bodies of evidence that I look at. Do you want me to go over them all now, or do you want to ask some questions about the curriculum? Or
yeah, okay. Let's talk about the curriculum a little bit, because it might not be obvious what the connection between particular learning and job competence is. So a lot of people like to allege that people are learning how to learn, and I know you discussed that at length in the book. So what's wrong with teaching someone about history or foreign languages or poetry or something, just so that they can have the experience of learning a difficult subject, just to build their general learning skills?
Right. So there's a whole area of psychology called educational psychology where they've been trying to measure these indirect effects of education for about a century. Right. The kind of people doing this research, of course, they want to find all sorts of hidden, subtle benefits of education. But, vast majority of people who work in this area, despite these motives, after 20 or 30 years of research, they're shell-shocked and they say, wow, it's very hard to find these effects. So for foreign languages, you're lucky if people even learn the foreign language. In fact, it's very rare that people do acquire any decent degree of foreign language competence in school. But, the evidence that this spills over into anything else, right, it just isn't there. There's a lot of experiments where they try to go and see if we go and teach people, say, a certain kind of math, just improve their ability to do physics. And even when the subjects are very tightly logically connected, unless you actually tell people you use the lessons from section A to solve the problems in section B, people just don't do it, right? It's just too intellectually hard for people to see through the details of the subject and then apply what they have learned in this thoughtful way. So, again, like as much as teachers would love to believe that you can teach students anything and they'll get better at everything, all the evidence says that's wrong and that learning is highly specific. And the way that people really get good at their jobs is by practice in those exact jobs. The way that you become a good pilot, you don't go and study Spanish and then this improves your learning ability and then you're a better pilot. The way you get to be a better pilot is you get in that flight simulator and you work on that. And then you get into a plane and you work on that and you get lots of practice. And that's how people actually get good at pretty much everything they do.
Right. So you're saying learning is domain specific. You need to learn the things directly that you want to be good at, not some other things that might be related.
Right. And it's not just me saying this. I'm saying that out of the people who professionally make this topic their careers, this is what they say. And I'm just a vessel. I'm just a messenger here. Because, I know what's funny is economists often express so much disdain for psychology. And then suddenly you point out, well, wait a second, most of what you study in school you would never use in the job. And they say, oh, well, you're learning how to learn and all this great stuff. Say, there is a field that you have so far never bothered to read where they do try to measure these effects you're talking about. And you know what they find? Nothing.
Yeah. It's one interesting thing about this book is how interdisciplinary it is, how it takes evidence from many different fields, and that's kind of refreshing in a book written by an economist.
Yeah, that's the so I research topics, not what some discipline has to say about something. So when I want to write a book about education, I try to find out what does anyone who's really thought about this and studied it have to say. This is why the book I was working on it for 6 years really, and most of it was just reading. So, this giant stack of stuff, and like each section, when I'm ready to read, my conscience is weighing on me, saying I don't know enough yet to write this. I got to read more. I've got to read more. And yeah, it slowed me down a lot, but hopefully, you can actually see the quality in the the amount of reading and effort that I put into it really shines through. That's of course my dream anyway. Right. I did make an effort to email every single person that I cited who was alive and try to get them to go and at least read the section of the book that discussed their work so that people could say, had I fairly summarized what they had done? Right. Out of the people who wrote back, everyone either said yes or I fixed it. Yes. Of course, there might be some people who didn't write back because they thought it was terrible. And I can't say what they thought because they didn't write back.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these other areas of evidence for the non-applicability of education to jobs. What kind of other things are there?
All right, so another one. So one that actually probably made the biggest impression on me is there's a whole literature on what's called credential inflation, mostly done by sociologists, although some economists do it too. Right, and the idea is trying to measure the extent to which rising education over time can be explained by a switch to more intellectual jobs versus an increase or ratcheting up of educational expectations in existing jobs. Right. So there's people who've studied everything back to 1940, really almost all the way up to the present. So during this time, there'd be about a 4-year increase in the average amount of education that Americans have. And the punchline of this work is only about 1 year of that 4 can be explained by a switch to more intellectual jobs like IT. And 3 out of the 4 is just that for the typical job that was existing in 1940, you now need about 3 more years to be considered worthy of employment. Right. And this is just what signaling predicts, because what signaling really says is that if more people get, have better signals, then you need more to be just as impressive as you were before. Right. And in fact, I'm doing a little bit of rounding, but multiple studies all come up to about 80% of the rise in education has just been sucked up in this credential inflation, very much as the signaling model would say.
Yes. So, to get technical about the signaling model, there's a separating equilibrium where high-skilled people go to school and low-skilled people don't go to school or do less school. And the thing about those models is that they have potentially multiple equilibria. You can have everybody coordinate on high school as the signal of competence, or you could have everyone coordinate on 4-year university or a master's degree or a PhD. And this inflation, this degree inflation, credential inflation, is basically saying that we've just let that equilibrium creep up. That we now coordinate around a higher number. What's the mechanism driving that, or some hypothesized mechanisms for why you would need more education to get the same job in 2018 versus 1960?
Yep, or 1940, was as far back as the data goes that I've seen. So I say one of the huge factors is government has made a lot of effort to expand accessibility to education. It has succeeded, but as accessibility has expanded, the number of people with degrees has multiplied manyfold. And so when employers are looking at an applicant pool, it's now much easier for them to say, no college, well, I'm throwing your application away. Right now, it really is true that jobs like waiter or bartender or parking lot attendant are very often held by people with college degrees, which would have been almost unheard of in 1940, right? And again, the signaling story is that, well, as degrees proliferate, employers can get picky. And when lots of other people get more education, the stigma against the people that don't increase their credentials gets worse. So, I like to say, when was it better to be a high school dropout, today or 1940? In 1940, tons of other people were in the same boat. Plenty of very good workers were in that boat, and so the stigma was pretty mild. Today, on the other hand, employers say high school dropout, ugh, yuck.
Yeah, it sends a different signal today because it's such a small portion of the population, and you really have to. If I met someone who was a high school dropout, I'd hope they were sort of a rare genius who was just too smart for school and that, but I would more expect that they had some serious behavioral issues, and were just unable to do the most.
I mean, if you're deciding who to interview for a job, most likely you look at that application and say, Well, I hope that he's got something good going for him, but I'm never going to find out because I don't have time to go and interview a bunch of people who dropped out of high school. Like the odds that I'm going to find a good worker out of that pool is pretty, or like, well, not zero. Still, it's low enough that it isn't worth my time looking very closely.
So, taking this into account, it seems like, okay, I mean, now assuming that it's true, that there's a lot of signaling going on, and it's very costly, you lose 4 years of your life and thousands of dollars.
And taxpayers lose even more.
One would think that employers could get talented people and save their applicants a lot of time and money by adopting some kind of different system, like, say, giving every applicant a test. Why don't we see more of that?
Yeah, so first thing is to remember that there is $1 trillion of government money in the United States poured on top of the status quo or on the side of the status quo every year. So this current system has in no way passed a market test. It is sustained by enormous subsidies, almost unimaginable magnitude. So, we should always keep that in the back of our minds. And when I've had a few economists saying, "Oh, the current system passes the market test," like, what planet are you on? Doesn't pass the market test? It's the biggest white elephant in the country. But the other thing I say is that, government money aside, one of the main things that you're signaling with your education is your conformity. Right? You're saying, look, these are social expectations that I get these degrees and that I graduate and so on. And there is a basic problem with signaling conformity in a new and creative way, which is, who are the people who are going to go and signal their conformity in a new, creative, untried, untested, radical, reformist way? And I say it's going to be nonconformists. So I say there is a catch-22 with trying to change conformity signaling. So I think that there's what I call locked-in syndrome, where once it's expected that a good job applicant will wear a suit, it's very hard to switch to the person who wears a kimono to an interview. You just look like a freak. And even if you were to say, well, if we'd all switch, it would be different. Yeah, but we're not all going to switch. It's always got to be at the hands of one person. So, while some of the traits that we are signaling with education, like just intelligence, work ethic, there's lots of ways that you can signal those. But I think it really is this conformity aspect of it that sort of locks the system down and freezes it. Although, again, I think it'd be great if we would just drastically reduce government funding to see how much good that would do. I think actually all the research that's out there says it would do a lot of good because price matters.
Right. Yeah, the current system is sort of artificially propped up by a lot of subsidies, and, it's telling that we sort of hold up our education system as, the height of our civilization. I even debated with someone recently online, they held up the fact that we don't have child labor as sort of a sign of just how far we've advanced over people of the past. And I was kind of saying, it wouldn't be so bad for, for a kid to get someone, or, someone 12, 13 to be doing coffee runs. It's not the same as a coal mine, but, just we sort of hold up our universal education as something really inherently good, not just some means to an end, but an end in itself. What do you say about that attitude?
Yeah, so, I've got a whole section called In Praise of Child Labor where I talk about all this and more. And here's the thing. There used to be some terrible things that happened in schools, too. My mom in the 30s went to a school where the nuns had sticks and they would hit children on their hands, right? And yet, if I were to bring this up and say school is bad, people would say, well, that was just some abuse a long time ago. Things aren't that way anymore. And I would defend child labor in the same way, saying, sure, there were some horrible things that were done to children in the past, but the idea that it'd be bad for a kid to have, a modern job, that their parents have, taken a look and seen, like what's happening to my kid here, right? And again, when people get all romantic, it's like these poor children, childhood should be a time for fun and exploring. It shouldn't be a time when you're made to sit still and just follow orders. It's like, yeah, well, what do you think school is? Right. So, and then it's like, oh, well, the employers are taking advantage of kids. And well, schools actually charge money, whereas even if it's an unpaid internship, at least you aren't paying them for it. So, basically everything good that you can say about school applies just as well to jobs the kids could get. Right. And one of the main things that I push in the book is it would be better that you have kids, especially kids who just don't like school, were being trained as apprentices when they're 13 or 14 or 15 and just getting acclimated to the world of work. In terms of the general romanticism that people feel about education, I think the best cure for this is say, stop talking in generalities and just remember what it was like for you. Was it really that great? right? For professors, it probably was that great. And then for them, I say, all right, fine, you had a great time. But of course you did. You're a professor. Like the whole system is geared around people like us to remember what the other students were feeling, like how bored they were, how much they wanted to be doing other things. And so was it good for them? Doesn't seem like it. And of course, if they're learning useful skills, then sometimes you have to suffer through that just to be prepared for the future. But if you're learning something that you're just going to forget after the final exam and you're miserable, then what's the point of that?
Yeah, I think you give the example of learning something and forgetting it immediately after the final exam. That's one of just many sort of examples that are really hard to explain if we truly believed that education is teaching us something useful, but really easy to explain if we believe that the signaling model is correct or explains a large part of education. Do you want to go through some other examples like that?
Yeah, sure. So again, let's think about that one more. So if the reason why education pays is that you're building skills, it would seem that employers would only pay for skills you still remember. It doesn't make sense for them to pay you for what you used to be able to do. Who cares about that? They should pay you for what you can currently do. And yet it does very much seem like being one Aristotle class short of graduation can derail a career. Right. Now, on the other hand, if what you're doing with education is signaling, then it makes a lot more sense that employers would care. Because if you learn a subject, get an A, and then forget it, you still are demonstrating a bunch of great talents. You're showing, look, I have the brains, work ethic, and conformity to go and get these grades. I don't remember the material, but it's not really relevant here anyway. What you now know about me is I'm the kind of person who can learn well and will knuckle under and do their work. And so, in fact, the signal can be totally valuable that you learned and then forgot something. Yeah, and you're right. There's a lot of other examples of just things that are very odd about education from a skill-based perspective that make a lot of sense from a signaling point of view. I mean, just think about this. All the students who are desperately looking around for easy A's, they just want to get the teachers with minimal expectations and who hand out A's like candy. Students love professors like this. They seek them out. And if you're trying to build skills, this is perverse. You don't learn much in classes where professors just hand out A's like candy. But if what you're trying to do is to trick employers into thinking that you're great, if you could just find a loophole, find a professor that gives out easy A's for low work, employers don't know that you didn't have to work that hard for it. So it really lets you impersonate a student that was better, right? Which is all for the good, right? So we could all think of classes that we've had where we learned nothing, even in the class, we weren't learning anything, but we get the easy A. And then that's a free A on the transcript that you didn't actually have to sweat for.
Right. And thinking back to my own time as an undergraduate, even when I took the more difficult courses and studied hard and things like that, I was mostly worried about, I need to learn this so I can pass this course and so I'll have an easier time passing the next course and the next one in the sequence. I study hard for Math 100 so I can do well in Math 200 so I can do well in Math 300. And
then it finally ends up that you're probably in a job where you don't use any of it. I don't know. Yes. I don't know what your day job is, or are you a full-time podcaster?
No. I'm an economics PhD student, so I fit into that category of the people who education was for.
Yeah. I mean, so like even the stuff I learned in grad school, you think of grad school as being like vocational school for professors, and some of it is. But other stuff that you learn, the only time you would ever use it is if you wind up teaching the very class you're currently in. So I teach our second semester PhD micro. That's almost the only time I would ever use general equilibrium theory, for example. Like that doesn't come up in my work, but like being able to go over some of the basic theorems and things like that. I do it, but only because my job is teaching the very subject I was once taught myself.
Right. Yeah, that's one way to see education as useful. And you kind of have pointed to that as a reason why economists are so willing to believe a more human capital story. We ourselves use the skills that we learned in school when we teach those very same skills. But of course that's an area where you learn the very things you use, but most workers are not PhD economists.
Yeah, that's right. So in the book, I call it intellectual inbreeding, and this is where you get a job teaching the very thing that you were once taught yourself, right? And again, the extent to which teachers just reteach whatever they learned when they were a kid is astounding if you really pay attention. you know, so I mean, on one hand it's funny, but on the other hand, it just shows how scholastic the whole mentality is like, I just go and am a vessel for the teachings of my teacher and my grand teacher and my great grand teacher and so on.
Yeah. But at least with econ, surely we're using some of our math or statistics are at least useful in the private sector.
Yeah, so the stats are much more useful. Again, of course, in the private sector, you're rarely going to do really fancy econometrics. You're probably just going to be running regressions. I mean, the amount of instrumental variables or something going on in the private sector, as far as I know, is minimal. But yeah, so that those are some of the most useful things that we get. And again, that's the stuff that we teach our students they're most likely to use. Even there, it's striking how often econometrics classes are taught as pure math theory with almost no applications and almost no hands-on computation. Right. And again, if we really wanted to provide human capital, we would have classrooms where every kid is in front of a computer with data loaded on it. And, it would be like a church, regress with me, my brothers and sisters. Let us do it together. That would be a much more human capital intensive way of doing it. But instead, it's like, all right, now let us prove that OLS is blue. Okay, great.
Right. Yeah, we don't teach it like a vocational class, although it is the most vocational thing we teach.
Yeah, so like in your graduate econometrics, what's the breakdown between theory and actual using a computer?
I'd say maybe 80-20.
So 80% theory, 20% using a computer?
Mm-hmm. And the exam is all theory.
So things are just as bad as they were 25 years ago when I was in your shoes. I was expecting to hear a somewhat better answer than that. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it depends on the prof, but
so in writing the book, I did go and just take a look at some syllabi for econometrics at top schools just to make sure that what I was saying wasn't out of date. And I think all the syllabi were ultra theory intensive with hardly any sign of doing anything practical. You'll basically have to wait until the second or third year class in applied econometrics before you're actually really using the computer and learning how to really do the craft of econometrics. Right? Because it's usually taught by an econometric theorist. So in their world, you gain prestige by proving theorems, not by solving real world problems.
Right, and that's sort of it's sort of an odd way that the education system is structured, that it's like we're all aiming for this target of making every single person a professor, and if you end up working in some job other than professor, it's because you've at some point failed or fallen off the wagon, right? You didn't go to grad school, or you did a co-op and then got a job offer, and that's sort of seen as some kind of failure within academia.
Yeah, and it's even more pathetic than that because, at a top program, the PhD econometric students, maybe half of them will go on to be professors, but most of them won't be professors of econometrics. So, people can't even be flexible enough to make the material relevant to professors in general, future professors in general. It has to be primarily geared to the one or two future econometric theorists in the room, right? Yeah, but again, it's a whole guild system where essentially professors are, they're like artists and we can teach whatever we want. And so what we teach is what's interesting to us. Like the amount of concern for, well, is this really useful to students? Who really cares? And again, of course, the students very rarely complain. They just say, well, complaining gets me nowhere. But jumping through hoops with a plum, on the other hand, it wins me a bunch of stickers on my forehead. Good job.
So there have been a lot of reviews of your book lately. The ones I've seen have been mostly positive.
Mm-hmm.
You posted a review by the economist David Balin on EconLog, and he complained that he thought your case you make is good, but that your solution is too radical. First, let's talk about what that solution is that you propose, and maybe defend why you think it is not too radical, as Balin argued.
Right. So yeah, very good question. The big thing that I push is cutting education spending, and I would say how in the world is that radical? Now you could say now I personally would say let's cut it a ton, and then you could say that's radical, but I don't see that's any objection to cutting education spending by 5% or 10%. And again, the whole idea of this is just as increasing access has caused credential inflation, decreased access, decreased funding by government would cause credential deflation. which again, I say would be a big benefit to society and to the students themselves, because you'd be able to go and get a good job with less education. Right. So, I mean, of course, spending a lot less is radical. I do embrace that, but I don't see any conceptual problem with what I'm saying. Again, like you say, if you say that's going too far, all right, fine, let's go and cut education spending by 5% or 10%. I mean, honestly, I'd be amazed if I could persuade people to cut it by 1% because it's so sacred. But again, just like the logic of if increased access causes credential inflation, that reduced access will cause credential deflation. I mean, again, that seems airtight to me, really. So yeah, so I mean, it doesn't seem like it's really that radical. I think we could, it seems like we should all be able to agree that there is a value to trying to get spending under control and get credential inflation under control, and then we could debate about how extreme we want to go. But yeah, I mean, I thought that was probably one of the weakest parts of David's review, because it's one thing to say you're being radical, another thing to saying the very idea of even a 1% cut in education spending is radical. Like, how is that radical? It wasn't that many years ago that it was 1% lower.
Well, I suppose the child labor proposal is pretty radical, although you weren't necessarily proposing to make every child work, just make it more socially acceptable. Yeah,
I mean, of course. And, like the main thing I was focusing on is kids who really don't like school, who are super bored, who are likely to drop out if you don't give them something else. Say at least, give them the option. But yeah, so, all of these ideas can be implemented either to a radical degree or to a moderate degree or to a super mild degree. And again, honestly, if I could just get the ball rolling in the right direction, I'd be highly gratified, because, obviously even most super successful public policy books don't wind up having any difference on policy. So if I could make a small dent in the giant edifice of the education system, I'd have a party. Like, I can't believe how much people listen to me.
Right. And, to just nudge the Overton window to make it even socially acceptable to say anything negative at all about education would be a big achievement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, again, like the fraction of Americans who favor cutting education spending is so minuscule, and yet again, I say that that doesn't you would cut it by a little bit, but even that people get freaked out about. And again, I don't think this is based upon any kind of subtle cost-benefit analysis or anything. It's more like saying, look, we need to go and cut back 3% on how much we do for mothers, where people are reacting not to the number, but to the very idea that you want to do the slightest amount less for mothers. And it's like, no, we must never do less for mothers. Like, well, how much would we have to be doing before it would be enough? You can be a decent person if you stay the same or more, but if you say any amount less, then you are, a pariah. Like, what kind of a monster would say such things?
Right. Yeah, I think the one part of education that is, prior to anyone reading your book, it's already controversial, is the fact that it's subsidized a lot through subsidized loans, which have pushed up the price. The college tuitions have seemingly moved up 1-to-1 with the availability of cheap credit to pay for that tuition, which ends up leaving a lot of people very deeply in debt. So, I mean, there are a lot of, but the people propose as a remedy to this that, things like college debt forgiveness, which I think you'd agree is not really tackling the root of the problem.
Yeah, so my view is that student loans are one of the most overblown complaints out of all against the higher education system. I mean, I would say that they are one of the parts of the system that are working least badly, and specifically because you have to pay the money back. So at least people have some reason to wonder, am I really going to be able to pay it back? How good of a job am I going to be able to get with this? At least the student loan program gives people some reason to question whether or not it really makes sense to go. And I say the real problem is just the free government money, like the outright grants, just sending large amounts of money to schools to go and make it cheap for all the students. And again, I say that's the real problem. So I do have a section in the book called "The Hidden Wonder of High Tuition and Student Debt," where I say, what's really good about this stuff is that these are the things that keep us from having an even worse problem. If school were free, or if the loans, you didn't have to pay the loans back, which would really make it free, then we'd have a much bigger credential inflation problem than we already do. So, this is all part of the way that people tend to turn around complaints about the system from thinking about it from a social point of view, which I think is the constructive way, to focusing on how I want free education for me. And it would be great if people would just go and forgive my loans. Right. And what's odd to me is even people who think there is too much college will often complain about student loans. And I'll say, well, look, if we forgive the loans, then this is a reason for people to get even more education than they're already getting. So what are you talking about?
So let's switch gears a little. Suppose you're a parent and you read this book and you're convinced, oh man, if my I don't have kids, but hypothetically, if I had a kid who was 5 years old, just about to enter the education system, and I'm thinking, oh man, this is all signaling. Is there a practical takeaway that I might take from that in decisions to make for myself or my kids?
Yeah, I say that, selfishly speaking, it doesn't make that much difference. But I do have a whole chapter on selfish advice. And the main mistake that I say that people are making right now is they're not adequately factoring in completion probability into their own decisions and to the advice they give to young people. So while it's true that successfully finishing college, for example, pays quite well, but a lot of people don't successfully finish. So again, only about 40% finish a 4-year degree on time if they are full-time students. So, if you do 5 years, then it's more like 55%. So if you stay long enough, eventually you'll probably be able to finish. But every extra year of spending is dragging down the payoff that you're getting per year of investment. So, my main advice as a practical matter to parents and students is just to very honestly and fairly try to assess what are your odds of doing well in college, for example. And I say the best predictor of how well you're going to do in college is how well you did in high school. It's not a perfect predictor. But again, the best way of predicting future performance is past performance. So, in the book, I do say, look, if my kids were C students in high school, I would try to find something else for them to do and rather than go to college, because C students have such a low completion rate. It's really pretty hopeless for them, or nearly hopeless. In terms of other practical life advice, I guess, the main thing I'd be saying is, once you understand the signaling part, if there's something that is signaling and you don't like it, look around for ways to weasel out of it. So, I homeschooled my older sons through middle school because I know that no one pays any attention to what you're doing in middle school. And I wasn't worried about that just because I know that it's flying below radar. When we're considering whether to homeschool them for high school, on the other hand, that's when I got very nervous and said, well, what's going on? How bad is the stigma against homeschoolers? How bad of a signal is this sending? And I tried to go and track down independent, neutral, objective scholars that could give me the answer. And most of them gave the answer is, maybe just a slight stigma, but if you do really remarkable things as a homeschooler, then you could probably get into a better college than you would have gotten into if you'd done regular high school. And I said, okay, fine. In that case, sounds good. But, I was super nervous about homeschooling for high school because even though I know that they waste a ton of time in regular school, I don't want my kids to have their opportunities stunted because their dad is crazy.
Yeah, and something like the SAT, which I'm Canadian, we don't have a single standardized test that we can take at the end of high school to say, hey, even though I did this unusual thing, here's the proof that I'm competent just from this one test. And I do think it's nice to have something like that, and it allows for more flexibility.
Canadians can take advanced placement tests. So, that's actually the main thing that I do with my kids is we do advanced placement tests. And again, I think a lot of homeschoolers would say, oh, that misses the whole point. We don't want to be teaching the test. We want to be free, doing free exploring. And that's good for some people. But again, I think those advanced placement tests, if you're going to teach for any test, they're great tests. Mostly, they're very intellectually demanding. You really have to know your stuff to do well. And so, me and my kids have really gotten a lot out of the AP testing process, right? And again, when you can get to a point where you can do well on those tests, that's when I say that, your stuff then. And again, and that's a lot of what we're going for is, intellectual mastery.
Right. What I like about your particular critique of education is that there's a lot of education critics who will start from some of the same premises you do, that a lot of what you learn in college is not very useful, but they'll go from that to say, therefore don't go to college, make a startup like Steve Jobs or something. But your critique is more nuanced, and you say, if you're the kind of person who college works for, go for it, but it's socially wasteful. So you're not giving bad personal advice.
Yeah, so the funny thing that I talk about in the book is there's really two standard views on school. There's it's not just economists who think this, but you think about it, it's the economic view that just says, look, school pays, therefore you must be learning a lot that's really great. And then there's the other people focus on the learning. They said people hardly learn anything, so school can't pay. And I say, you both have half of the truth here. The truth is that you don't learn much in school, but it does pay a lot. And the reason why is that even though you're not learning much, certainly not much that's useful, you are nevertheless impressing employers with your efforts. And that's actually why it pays so well.
So we're running out of time. Do you have any closing thoughts, any sort of overarching idea that you'd like listeners to come away with after hearing this conversation, and hopefully before buying your book?
Yeah, sure. So by the way, the book is only $20 on Amazon now, so order now. But if in terms of closing thoughts, here's the main one that occurs to me. So a lot of people hear everything that I'm saying and they nod their heads and says, yes, this makes perfect sense. But the problem is that Bryan is a Philistine economist who doesn't understand that the point of school isn't job training to begin with. It's about expanding people's minds and exploring ideas and culture and developing your personality and so on. And I do have a whole chapter dealing with these issues. And what I say is, first of all, I'm not a regular econ Philistine. Like ideas and culture in my life, I really take this stuff seriously. But there's a big difference between these high aspirations and what schools really accomplish. So you can't just say that schools should develop the whole person and therefore they're great. You need to show that, in fact, that they do deliver on this. And this is actually an empirical question. You can go and take a look and see, well, how much personal enrichment do people actually get out of school? Right. And here I say just very little because most people find it super boring. Right. And people say, well, if it were only taught in the best possible way, then they wouldn't find it boring anymore. That's not true. I have this quote from Steven Pinker, a big professor at Harvard in the book, where he says, look, I'm routinely voted one of the best professors at Harvard, maybe the best school in the world. These are the best students in the world. And yet halfway through the semester, half my students aren't there. So, clearly, even the best students in the world seem to find that one of the best teachers in the world boring, and they don't care. Right. And so I say, you have to think about things like this when you're making claims about how enriching school is. Just realizing, to most people, it is not. Right. So it's actually, just it really is a drag for most people. They don't go for it. And so, you don't need to be a Philistine. You don't need to say bah humbug to the higher aspirations of education to still have a very negative view about actually existing education. Right. And then, again, what couldn't we reform it? Couldn't we fix it? The main thing I say there is that it's much easier to identify waste and stop doing it than to come up with something better. Right. So if you find something you're doing some wasteful spending, I say, well, once you realize it's wasteful, just stop right away. Just cut that spending, stop wasting taxpayer money, stop wasting student time, and then take a deep breath and say, all right, now, is there something better that we could be doing with this money and time? For that, let's calmly, deliberately, slowly, and cautiously weigh the alternatives and don't just accept teachers' propaganda at face value because they have shown already that they are not worthy of our trust.
My guest today has been Bryan Caplan. Bryan, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, that concludes today's interview. The discussion question, which I'll be sharing at the Facebook group, that's Economics Detective on Facebook. It's a closed group. You can go request to join it. The discussion question today for that group is, what was your personal experience of education like? Did it work out for you overall? Did it lead to a good job? And what was the day-to-day experience like? Were you, like many students, bored and apathetic, or were you one of the one or two students who loved every minute of it? So once again, to answer that discussion question, join the Economics Detective group on Facebook.